In a frozen Siberian tomb, archaeologists found something that should have rotted 2,500 years ago. Inside a bronze vessel, burnt seeds, the same seeds Herodotus said turned the Scythians into something not quite human. The Scythians ruled 3,000 miles of grassland for 1,300 years. They defeated the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled. They drank from cups made of human skulls. They scalped enemies for sport. And then they got high. For 2.5 millennia, we asked the same 3 questions. What plant was in that bowl? What did it do to them? And were they really one people, or something stranger? In 2021, and again in 2025, ancient DNA finally answered all 3. They appear around 900 BCE on the Eurasian steppe, that endless ocean of grass running from the Carpathian Mountains to Mongolia. They do not call themselves Scythians. That word comes from an ancient root meaning shooter, because the only thing more famous than their cruelty was their bow. A climate shift in Central Asia killed the old farming way of life. 2 separate populations went mobile at the same time, one from the Altai Mountains in the east, one from the Urals in the west. They never stopped moving again, and they were huge. Skeletal analysis of elite burials shows men consistently between 1.80 m and 2 meters tall, 10 to 15 centimeters taller than the commoners they ruled. Longer arms, longer legs, denser bones. Imagine a 6'7" man on horseback, holding a composite bow that could punch through Persian armor at 100 meters. Now imagine 10,000 of them. Persia met them in 513 BCE. Darius the Great marched into the steppe with 700,000 men. He came back with almost nothing. The Scythians never stood and fought. They burned everything behind them, poisoned the wells, vanished, returned at night, and bled the largest army on earth dry across 1,000 miles of empty grass. That is who they were. That is the easy part of the story. The hard part is what they did with what they killed. Herodotus describes it in such detail that for 2,000 years, historians dismissed him as inventing horrors. Then archaeologists started digging. When a Scythian killed his worst enemy in battle, he did not keep the head as a trophy. He sawed the skull below the eyebrows in a single clean cut, hollowed it out, and turned it into a drinking cup. Poor warriors wrapped the outside in oxhide. Wealthy ones lined the inside with sheet gold. At feasts, they passed these cups around and drank wine from the men they hated most. Then there were the scalps. Every Scythian was expected to bring scalps back from war. The technique, a circular incision from ear to ear, a hard pull to separate the skin, then scraping the inside clean with the rib of an ox. The pelt was cured like leather and tied to the rider's bridle. The more scalps swinging from your reins, the higher your rank. Some warriors had so many they sewed them together into cloaks. It got worse. Herodotus wrote that they used human skin for leatherwork, quivers, clothing, saddle covers. The right hand of an enemy, including the fingernails, was peeled whole and turned into a quiver lid, because the hand was already shaped right. The skin of a man, he wrote, is thick and glossy, and sometimes, when the enemy was important enough, they skinned him entirely, stretched the hide across a wooden board, and rode with it. For 2,000 years that sounded like a Greek making things up about people he had never met. Then, in 2023, microscopic analysis of leather fragments from Scythian quivers in Ukraine confirmed it. Some of them are made of human skin. And then there was the war god. In the center of every major camp, the Scythians built a vast mound of brushwood. At the top, they drove a single iron sword into the wood, point down. That sword was the god. Once a year, they brought their prisoners to it. 1 in every 100 was selected. Wine was poured over his head. He was beheaded. His blood was collected in a bowl, carried up the mound, and poured over the sword. The remaining 99 watched. The ruining themselves, though, the loyalty was absolute. Warriors of equal rank could bind themselves to each other as blood brothers. They cut their own arms with their own weapons, dripped the mixed blood into a cup of wine, dipped their swords, arrows, and battle axes into the cup, and drank together. The pact lasted until death. A gold plaque from the Coloba burial, 4th century BCE, shows two men nose to nose sharing the cup. We can see them. The image survives. The women fought too. This is not legend. Around the 6th century BCE, a tribe called the Sauramatians married into the Scythians and brought a custom with them. A woman who had not killed in battle could not marry. Burials from Armenia to Kazakhstan have produced female skeletons 3,000 years old, buried with arrowheads, bow-strung shoulders, battle-broken bones, and blade fragments still embedded in them. The Greek legend of the Amazons was not a fantasy, it was a memory. This was the culture, this was the daily life of the people in the next part of the story, because after the battle ended, they had to come down. Here is what Herodotus wrote in History's Book 4, around 440 BCE. After a burial, the Scythians purified themselves like this. They took 3 wooden poles and leaned them together at the top, forming a small tent. They covered it with thick wool felt, sealed tight. Inside, they dug a shallow pit and dropped red-hot stones into it. Then, and this is the line, the Scythians take the seed of this cannabis and throw it upon the red-hot stones, where it smolders and gives off a vapor that no Greek steam bath could surpass. And the Scythians howl with joy at the vapor. That word, cannabis, appears in this passage for the first time in recorded human history. And the Greeks did not have a name for the plant. The Scythians did. Our word for it descends directly from theirs. Every time someone in the modern world says the word cannabis, they are pronouncing a syllable that crossed a frozen steppe in the Iron Age. For 2,500 years, that passage was treated as travelers' tales. Then, in 1947, a Soviet archaeologist named Sergei Rudenko cracked open a burial mound at Pazyryk, deep in the Altai Mountains. The tomb had been sealed by ice for 2.5 millennia. Everything inside was preserved. What he found, sitting next to a noble woman's body, was a wooden frame, 6 poles, 1 meter 20 tall, with traces of felt clinging to them. Beside it, 2 bronze censers. Inside the censers, blackened stones and burnt hemp seeds. In a leather pouch nearby, more seeds, plus coriander and sweet clover, both used across Central Asia to mask harsh smoke. Herodotus had not invented anything. He had described a ritual that was still being performed on the other side of the world from him, and the archaeology survived to prove it. But here is the catch most people do not tell you. Cannabis seeds do not get you high. The intoxicating compounds live in the flower, so why are only seeds in the archaeological record? Because flowers do not preserve. Seeds, especially burnt seeds, last forever. Flower material is gone in a single season. Almost every archaeologist working on this site assumes the Scythians threw the whole plant onto the stones, flowers, leaves, seeds, and only the seeds survived for us to find. That is the cannabis half. The other half is opium. Excavations at multiple Scythian kurgans have recovered wooden braziers, sealed leather tents, and bowls with residue of both burnt hemp and opium poppy. They were not using cannabis alone, they were combining it with opium. Calm, plus euphoria, plus vision. A cocktail engineered to dissolve the boundary between the living and the dead. And the timing matters. They were not using this during battle. The image of berserkers howling on horseback, swords swinging, foaming with cannabis rage. That is internet history. What the archaeology actually shows is consumption before and after. Before, to enter ritual trance, to consult the spirit world, to prepare for what was coming. After, to commune with the dead, to honor fallen warriors, to feel the war god move through the camp, which brings us to the part of this story that is harder to swallow than skull cups. The viral version of the Scythians is the one where the plant turned them into berserkers, drug-fueled steppe demons, mindless killing machines, the Eastern Vikings with better chemistry. That version sells. It is also wrong. What the evidence actually points to is more disturbing than that, not less. These were not lunatics on a high. These were a people whose religious technology was so refined, so deliberate, that they could scalp a man in the morning, peel his hand for a quiver in the afternoon, and weep with ecstasy in a felt tent at sundown, not in spite of the violence, but as part of one continuous spiritual conversation with their gods. The cannabis and the opium were not fuel for the killing. They were the language used to talk to the dead afterward. The Scythians were not berserkers, they were shamans on horseback, who happened to be the most efficient killers in the ancient world. That is why the thumbnail of this video says what it says. Not barbarians, something more coherent than barbarism. Something that could integrate all of it, the cruelty, the grief, the joy, the smoke, into one functioning culture. That is what no other source could tell us. But the DNA told us something the bones could not. In 2021, the Max Planck Institute published the largest ancient DNA study of the steppe ever attempted. 111 Scythian and pre-Scythian genomes, spanning 1500 years and most of Central Asia. In 2025, a second team added 131 more individuals from the western Scythian range, the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Together they answered a question no historian alone could. The Scythians were never one people, they were a mosaic. The genetic base was the old Bronze Age herder ancestry, Yamnaya and Andronovo, the cattle people who had ruled the steppe 1,000 years earlier. But layered on top of that base were waves, Iranian ancestry pouring in from the south, East Asian ancestry arriving from the Far East, Siberian ancestry creeping down from the taiga. Western Scythians near Ukraine kept more European Neolithic blood. Eastern Scythians, the Sarka and the Pazyryk burials, carried more Iranian and East Asian. Genetically, a Scythian from the Black Sea and a Scythian from the Altai were almost two different peoples. Culturally, they were one. That is the finding. They were not united by blood. They were united by culture, by the bow, by the horse, by the war god on the mound, by the burnt seeds in the felt tent. The Scythians invented themselves. The elite, though, were tighter. The men in royal burials share a single Y chromosome lineage, R1010, and the marriages were close. High rates of endogamy, keeping the bloodline of power inside one extended family. The DNA confirms what Herodotus said. The royal Scythians were a closed warrior aristocracy. Everyone else was just allowed to call themselves Scythian. And there is one more fingerprint they left on the modern world, and most Europeans are carrying it right now without knowing. A mutation in the ALOB A gene, fructose intolerance, harmless on a diet of meat, milk and blood, dangerous on a diet of fruit and honey. It exploded across the Scythian population because their diet did not punish it. From them, it spread across Western Eurasia. Today it is the single most common genetic cause of fructose intolerance in modern Europeans. If sugar makes you sick, there is a non-trivial chance you are reading the metabolism of a Scythian. By the 3rd century BCE, the Scythians vanish from history. Pushed out by the Sarmatians, absorbed, scattered. For 2,000 years, scholars assumed they had died out completely. The DNA says otherwise. Their language survives in exactly one place, Ossetian, spoken in the Caucasus Mountains today, the only direct linguistic descendant of the Scythian tongue on Earth. Their genes survive everywhere they rode. Strongest echoes in modern Lithuanians, Estonians, and Northwest Russians. Audible signals in Kazakhs and Kyrgyz across the old steppe belt. Trace amounts in millions of people from London to Beijing who do not know they are walking around with a piece of the bowman, and the word the noble woman of Pazyryk whispered into her felt tent 2,500 years ago, cannabis, is still in your mouth every time you say it. That is the Scythians, the plant, the cocktail, the cruelty, the shamans, the DNA. If you want the next tomb, Carthage, a people Rome believed it erased completely, whose blood is still walking the Mediterranean coast. Subscribe. We open it next.